And the reason why we hurt so bad, because we don't have a sense of who and what we are and how we are in this country. We don't have a history. There's salvation in doing what he's telling us to do, amen? I look at our indoctrination, and I may hit on that a little bit later. How we are as a people. Our plight in this life. As a people, I'm gonna hit a little bit of it right now. We were a people with no identity. And I want you to look up identity for me. We didn't really have a history. We was made right here in America. Y'all with me? Most Afro-Americans, right? Our ancestry is mostly African. The average Afro-American has between 20 and 25% European blood. Y'all with me? Yes, sir. Y'all know where that came from, right? That came from rape and plunder. Y'all with me? Yes. That's how we got that European blood. Oh, my great-great-great-great-grandmother was married to a white man. You're delusional. It was against the law. You understand what I'm saying? I'm talking about a slave woman didn't have no rights. She was violated. Give me identity.
Identity. The word identity means condition or character as to who a person or what a thing is.
You heard that? Who are you? Who are you? Check this out. I was just meditating and thinking. The African was brought to America. He was brought to America as a slave. And the institution of slavery that he was introduced to, right, was one of the worst in history. An African slave was dehumanized first. And dehumanized means when you deprive somebody of all human qualities and you divest them of any identity or individuality. Y'all with me? Check this out. They were starved. I remember reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass said the thing he remembered most as being a slave was being hungry all the time. They were starved, they were whipped. If they didn't meet their cotton quotas or the tobacco quotas in the field, they were whipped. And a slave worked from sun up to sundown. And if the moon was full, they work them all night. They were raped. A man, neither a woman, had no control over their body. The master's sons, the overseer, the man from the plantation over here, you understand what I'm saying? They were hunted. Now, a slave that wanted to get away was considered a bad slave. He was considered a hostile slave, so they hunted him. You understand what I'm saying? A lot of them were hung. And the ones that they couldn't tame, right, they did stuff like they cut off their feet so they couldn't run. They would cut their hamstrings, do them all kind of stuff. You understand what I'm saying? That's trying to bring this home to us. They were terrorized. When somebody got whipped, they made everybody come out and watch. When it was doing that butt busting, right? When they were mean just demeaning, degrading in a harshest way, those men. They made everybody look. They made his wife, his mother, his children, everybody look at what was going on. Terrorized, and was deprived of any kind of human dignity. Look, there were laws that prohibit you from learning to read and write. Children were fed in troughs like animals. No utensils there to use their hands. Y'all done seen some of those pictures, that slave clothing. The slave house, the slave quarters, look, was prime, it was a prime breeding ground for disease. Typhoid, fever, all kind of diseases. You understand what I'm saying? Dirt flows, cold in the winter, hot in the summer. I was reading a slave narrative last week that the slave, he said, was 91 years old, and he said the only thing they let them eat was turnips. They ate turnips 7 days a week. He said every now and then they would get a biscuit. You know, and he said when they had biscuits, they used to have to race, they used to run for them, try to outrun each other. Now that's slavery here in the U.S. Now in 1865, look, the slaves were freed, right? But then after that, you know, they fought that big war. Those white men killed each other, over 600,000 of them, right? Would be equivalent to like about 5, 6, 7 million a day. All those men died, right? And after that, the whites in the South, you know the subject of their hatred and their blame was the former slave. He was the focus of their hatred and their anger. Then they enacted laws, black codes. Now, they already had black codes in the North. You know, people thought it was good for the slave in the North. No, it wasn't. They had black codes. You know, look, Jim Crow laws, right? It was even against the law, Sister Vanessa, for a slave not to have a job. Why? Because if he didn't have a job, they could arrest him, right? And they could send him out in the field to work. Look, so black codes, and then you had the KKK. If any of you, if any slave ever accumulated anything, right? And the KKK was there to terrorize them and to knock them down and to take everything they had and to hang them. Just showing you the plight of the Afro-American. Then in 1896, right, they challenged it in 1886. By 96, 10 years later, they got to the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson. They didn't side with the former slave. They sided with the white supremacists, and then they made it the law of the land. Now it's not only in the South, even though they already had it in the North, but it's more profound now because it's the law of the land for everybody. Y'all remember that separate but equal stuff? Man, and when Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston went against it, right, they showed how damaging it was. You know, there's a couple of psychologists that did those experiments with those dolls. They asked them which doll is bad. They point to the black one, which one is evil. You understand what I'm saying? But everything was good about the white. So psychologically, your DNA is messed up because you've been taught to hate yourself. Then in those 1800s, right, you had underfunded and inadequate schools. You were miseducated because you never learned your history. Then you had redlining. You know what redlining is? You know, what they did is they draw boundaries where Afro-Americans live, right? So banks said that we won't invest in that community. We won't let them buy houses and stuff like that. All that was deliberate. You know, then what they did is they made the suburbs after World War II. And they let all those white folks go to the suburb and they gave them mortgage loans, right? But guess what? They didn't give them to Afro-Americans. They didn't give them to them. So I want you to see that the stack, that the stack, it was already stacked against you. I mean, it was deliberate to keep you down. Y'all with me? Now they challenged those laws. Now, even after Brown versus the Board of Education, right? Now, what Brown was supposed to do, it was supposed to desegregate public offices, schools, and all that, right? Then people even fought against that. They didn't do it. The federal government had to send troops down here to enforce it. Y'all remember the Ruby Bridges and all those? Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? You know, what happened in Arkansas? Man, it was beat. One high school young man got separated from the rest of them, right? He had the time wrong. Man, he went to school, they almost beat him to death. Just want to put this out there. I want us to see something. Then, you know, you had Brown versus the Board of Education. Y'all saw the civil rights, the hoses, the dogs, the whippings, the beatings, right? Yeah, not until 1964 you had civil rights. You know, so it was legal, you know, it was the law that you be a second-class citizen. And then in 65, now even though the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, right, or the 15th Amendment gave you voting rights, right? They had to come back in 65 to do the Voting Rights Act. You know why? Because they weren't letting you vote. You know why was voting so important? Because voting gave you representation. They fought a whole war. They said they wasn't gonna let the king, King George, tax them without no representation, no taxation without representation. You understand what I'm saying? The man was putting taxes on stuff and they wanted to have a voice. Not that for us. 1965, Voting Rights Act. Then they had to come back in 1968 and do fair housing. Don't you know, check this out, even in cities up north like Chicago and Harlem and stuff like that, right, where you had concentrations of Afro-Americans. They put them in slums, and guess what? Their rent was twice as much as the rent of white folks that were living in decent housing. Y'all with me?
Yes, sir.
Then, in 1971, they had the war against drugs. That's when they started to criminalize black life. They didn't go after the real drug dealers or the people that was bringing the drugs in here, right? They went after the poor and uneducated. They went after street level crime. Y'all remember the crack epidemic? How crack got into this country? They were fighting a war, a civil war in Nicaragua. You know, and the US government was funding it. You know, you had the Contras. You know, they were fighting to overthrow Daniel Ortega, who was the president of Nicaragua, and he actually became president of the revolution. And they labeled him as communist. So when Congress was doing their job back then, right? You know, so Congress passed a law, no, we're not gonna take US dollars and back these Contras. So they wanted the war to continue. So you know what they did? They used drug money. They started importing these cocaine into these neighborhoods and stuff. And they used that money to fund the war. But what it did, it fueled the crack epidemic, right? And then after during the crack epidemic, you had mass incarceration. Check this out. Afro-Americans are 12% of the population, 12 to 13%. But we 40% of the prison system. And what I'm trying to show you is that was done deliberate. Now, and look, we still dealing today. Now, affirmative action was necessary. When Woodrow Wilson became president, I believe in 1916, right? They had a whole lot of Afro-Americans working for the government, right? He was a Southern Democrat, right? So when he got into office, what he did is he got rid of all those Afro-Americans out of the government. You know, and he was a segregationist and he was a white supremacist. You know, he even had a showing of that movie. Y'all ever heard of Birth of a Nation? He even had a showing of that in the White House. So affirmative action came just to have some fairness in hiring because you were deliberately excluded. Not because they were trying to meet any quotas or anything like that. There wasn't no quotas. See, the people in power controls the narrative. They give you your thoughts. And the reason why we hurt so bad, because we don't have a sense of who and what we are and how we are in this country. You know, we don't have a history. Most people don't care about this. You give us a second line, you give us a party, you give us some liquor, you give us a football game, you give us the Saints. You know, you give us the state championship yesterday, Carl versus St. Paul. You know, a good day in the park, a free plate of red beans, and a bottle of beer, we all right. Look, you take away your voice, no representation. Look, we've been exploited. We've been used for our labor. We've been vilified. And we've been ostracized. Ostracized just simply means we've been excluded. And I'm trying to show you our indoctrination into this country. Now, and let me tell you something else. They didn't do any better for poor white folk, neither, yeah. They just deceived them. Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president of the United States. He said, you take the best black man, he said Negro or Afro-American, and you take the poorest white man. He said, if you tell him, if you convince him that he's better than him, right? He said, you could pick his pocket without him knowing. And then he turned around and he said, if you give him somebody to look down upon, he'll empty his pockets for you. You know, what I want to bring home to us, you know, is we got to wake up. I mean, all of us, everybody. And I want us to really look at what the Lord is telling us and do it. Now, the Lord is trying to make us a people. And in order for him to make us a people, we got to come out from among this. Say, come out from among them. Be ye separate, saith the Lord. He said, touch not that unclean thing. And he said, and I'll receive you. He's trying to give us his spirit. Y'all with me?